Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 124. And today we're going to be talking about why top players win more and why is it not me. And of course, it's all going to be in the context of MH3. So we're going to be talking about the new set and some data for different skill levels of players. Before we go into that, I would like to thank mtgazone.com for being my sponsor. And I would like to thank my patrons. And I do have several new patrons this week. But don't worry, you can beat this next time and move on to an even higher number. We have new patrons. It's Eli, Reese, and Michael. So thank you very much for that. As always, the patrons are really what keeps it going because these are the continuous streams of income that I can get from the seminars I'm doing, which is great, and which is definitely keeping me motivated to churn out this content and dig deeper into the data. Otherwise, I might have been getting lazy. So if you have any cash floating, please do support by all times, or just join as a free patron. That way you will get updates on what I'm doing, and maybe over time you'll get convinced that you might want to be joining. All right, and with this out of the way, as always, a preamble. This time it's a pretty short one in text. Losing happens, own it. This so far has been the worst format I've had. I started it really well. I mean, my first 7-8 drafts that I did, I had 70% win rate, and then something stopped, and I couldn't win for the love of it. And while doing this episode, I actually started realizing why it was so. But it is terrible for everyone that plays Magic that all of a sudden something stopped working. And it's always a combination of factors. I've been a bit poorly last week, so I was probably playing at not even close to 100% of my capacity. At the same time, I was misguided in how the format was shaping up. So I was doing wrong things in the draft. At certain moment, also, this tilt arrived when you're losing, so you start doing things differently, and then very often you start doing things differently in a way that is absolutely non-viable. So I ended up like with weird mixtures of, I don't know, Eldrazi energy decks and stuff like that, and I couldn't find my lane. And when I found my lane, I just got paired up, and every game I played, there was a turn 3 Chrysalis into turn 4 Chrysalis, and I couldn't do anything about it. And it was super disheartening. So I stopped playing for a couple of days, watched some streams, came back, and just yesterday I managed to return to my trophy streak with a sweet Selesnya Blink deck. It was really nice. It was fun playing, and it sort of regenerated my mind a bit because I sort of figured out, yes, I still can play the game. I recovered from my cold. Everything looks pretty much better, but it's important to understand that formats like that will happen, or streaks like that will happen, and you should not be rage quitting. Even though I did bash my hand on the table more than once during games when you think you stabilize and all of a sudden the situation changes quite a lot. This format is very swingy, and this is something that will happen. Of course, you don't start dancing from joy when the swings happen in your favor, but when it happens to you, especially several times in a row, you start getting frustrated. But even though there is variance involved, don't forget that most likely the reason why you're losing is because you're doing something wrong. And this is the moment to, as I said, stop, step back, watch some streamers, see what they're doing, focus on situations when you would do something differently, think about it, why they are doing it differently than you. And then if you are the losing player, probably they are doing the things right and you are doing the things wrong. One thing I realized, thanks to, of course, Corticols, who is still, I think, the top limited pundit currently available. Thanks to Corticols' podcast, I figured out I was definitely over relying on the sacrifice lands, putting too many of them in my deck, dedicating too high picks to pick them, and that was one of my problems. other thing that I was doing was too easily going into the Gruul Eldrazi lane. And this happened to me several times. And in the end, I noticed it and I corrected accordingly. That I started my draft, I got like Chrysalis, maybe even a second Chrysalis. And then I start drafting red green and it dries out after 4 picks and there's nothing going on. And for me, the signal right now is that if after 4 picks, I already start looking at blue cards and start going full Timur, that's probably a bad signal for me that how this draft is going to end up. So I corrected also on this one. I started to avoiding red green or maybe picking the Chrysalis still because the card is pretty busted. But maybe not with the first plan being an Eldrazi, but my first plan is having it. If the lane appears, go for it. If the lane doesn't appear, potentially think about splashing. Like indeed, my Selesnya deck from yesterday that I trophied with did have a Chrysalis splashed, and it was not a problem just playing a Chrysalis as a splash creature. It had plenty of synergy. I mean, I had 2 of the guides of something. The 1/2 that gains life whenever a creature enters the battlefield and gives you energy. And 2 of the 2 mana 1/2s that also gain your life whenever a creature enters the battlefield. So Chrysalis was great in that deck because at one stage it gave me like 12 life when it enters the battlefield and stabilized. Yeah, Guide of Souls, thank you very much. Getting 12 life and a sizable creature was a great thing to have in that particular deck, and it also enabled like fast games. Now 2 are not fair. I mean, this deck had basically could have lightning fast starts with the guide, and also in the late game, because I had a bunch of blink and a bunch of Eerie Auxiliary and a bunch of the Evolution Witness. If I got to the late game, I was usually at 50 life. I could bring back anything from my grave at will, and there was absolutely nothing my opponents could have done, even if they had like a massive Eldrazi. They were just standing there idly because they could never attack me. Sweet deck. But yeah, this is the result of me spending a week losing and trying to figure out why I'm losing and picking the healthy approach of probably it's my fault and thinking about what I was doing wrong. So if you are in the same situation, I totally feel for you because it is frustrating and you start doubting your general ability. Luckily, I'm absolutely in love with myself, so there's no problem with me to rationalize it. But at the same time, I also don't like losing, so I will just not blame it on external conditions. I know how it works, so I will start looking for the reasons why I do that, and without losing too much confidence, try to figure my way back into the format. And I think I am in a much better place right now than I was a week ago when I was super frustrated. But okay. This is important because in the end, this should be our hobby and not something that adds to our daily stress. So make sure that you try to at least follow this rule as closely as it's possible. You know, you won't avoid those fists on the table in frustration, but hopefully you will not go further than that. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about why do better players win more? What do they do differently? And I always try to make this episode a bit more philosophical about how you learn playing Magic and how you should approach it, not only when you are a good player that wants to become a great player, but also if you are like a starting player that wants to become a decent player and move on. Because I think that the approach that you should be taking is very different from where you're starting. And I think that content in general does not focus too much on those nuances between players who are just starting. And that might be detrimental to the people that are starting because they will be trying to replicate something that is available for advanced players while not being ready to do that just yet. Before we go into that, a quick look at the metagame evolution, because I think that the few things have happened over the first 2 weeks. First of all, how people play colors has changed ever so slightly. So when we started the format in the first week, there was a lot of decks that were splashing, a lot of decks that were 3 colors or even more than 3 colors. And all those categories dropped, and there is much more of the two-color decks being played. So it's increased from 30% to 38%, while two colors and splash dropped from like 39 to 35, and there's like a 1 percentage point drop in three-color decks, and 2 percentage points drop in decks that have three and a splash or even more. Because we're talking about the ability levels, we can also look at the top players in the 17 Lens database. And here we see the same trend, but even more pronounced. So two-color decks became 39%. The top players were playing much more of the splash decks in the first week, but that also dropped by more than in general population. Three-color decks stayed roughly the same, but there was a big drop of the more than three-color decks from 10 to 7.6%, because in week one, top players were playing a lot of the nonsense four-color decks, because I think that splashing was available through the lands, and I think that the lands have dropped in popularity somewhat over the first week. So yeah, very similar graphs actually when you look at it between top players and general population. And this, you have to think that top players are something like 10% of the 17 lands data. So it's impressive that general population is so close in their tendencies as the top players are. In terms of which two-color pairs were being played, this is only looking at two colors. So it doesn't account for the fact that the two-color decks increased in popularity altogether. It only looks at if there are two-color decks and two-color decks with a splash, how did they change in terms of popularity? One big thing, and I really hope that I'm not the cause of that, because I made a big thread on how to play Dimir decks on Twitter, but definitely the Dimir decks have increased in popularity after the first week. In first week, I was playing a lot of Dimir, and that probably was the reason why I had a very high win rate, because I figured out how to build Dimir decks. They were super open for the first couple of days, and that's why I wrote my thread. And since then, I never could even remotely see a Dimir lane in any of my drafts, and I never played Dimir again since. So probably that's because everyone in the population sort of figured out that Dimir is actually a decent color combination. We also see that Boros has increased from 16% to 18%. Dimir increased from 7.6 to 12.8. That's quite a big increase. And another deck that increased in popularity ever so slightly is Azorius from 5.4 to 6.9. What has dropped? Well, the biggest drops are Rakdos from 10.4 to 8.8, Gruul from 13.4 to 11.7, and Simic from 16 to 14, roughly. And all the other colors also dropped slightly. Selesnya from like 10 to 9, Orzo from 6.7 to 5.8, Golgari from 8 to 7, and Izzet from 6.4 to 5.6. So like smaller drops for those ones. But yeah, the biggest change was definitely Dimir jumping from 7.6 to 12.8. That's something that did happen. When you look at the top players, it's quite similar, but the increase in Dimir was even more pronounced there. It went from 8.3 to 14.8. Increase in Azorius also more pronounced, from 5.5 to 8. And Boros is sort of at the same level, but you have to keep in mind that top players, even in week one, were super high on Boros. It was like 19% of the two-color metagame. Now it's 20. There was a big drop in how they played Gruul, from 15.4 to 12.7%, and a smaller drop in Simic from 14.1 to 12.6. And all the other colors, Rakdos had a bigger drop, like from 10 to 8, more or less. And the other ones, they just like dropped by 1 percentage point, the same like in the general population. Again, very close graphs, only slightly more pronounced. And this is something that I've seen in literally every format. I did this analysis for every single format since Midnight Hunt. And in every of those formats, I see that top players they have slightly wider range of how they play their decks, which means that they play more with the good decks and less with the poor decks. So they are definitely having more preference towards those better color pairs, or at least the color pairs that they perceive as being good. At the same time, when you look at the win rates, strangely enough, despite increase in popularity, Dimir is one of the few archetypes that actually increased their win rate over the first week. It started at 54.6 and now it's 54.9. So improvement on how the deck is being built has covered the fact that the deck has been drafted higher. Most other colors did drop, and general win rate also did drop. The other color that did increase in terms of its win rate, and I think that this is now if last week I was telling you that Dimir is the secret sauce for the format, I think that now the secret sauce for the format is Selesnya, which is still quite underdrafted. It's as you can see, around 9%, 8.3% for top players. That has a decent win rate of 56.7. And yeah, I think it's slightly decreasing in popularity, which means it's open more frequently than not. So if you're looking for an original lane that might utilize the best of the green cards and maybe some quality in the white cards, I would look at Selesnya builds. I would check the 17 lands for the trophy decks, see what people are doing in order to win, and try to emulate that, because I think that this is the sort of like open thing right now. Two big losers in terms of the win rate are Gruul and Boros. Gruul dropped from 60.2 to 58.4, and Boros dropped from 59.8 to 58.4. I mean, I'm saying big losers. They're still the two most winning archetypes, Selesnya being third and Azorius being fourth. But yeah, it's not the bonanza of the first week when they were winning literally everything. And all the other color pairs are in the same kind of zone, between 53 and 54 percentage points. So very close between Rakdos, Orzhov, Golgari, Simic, Izzet in terms of the win rate. Yeah. When we look at the top players, similar trends, some more pronounced drops. But also I would like to note that Dimir has dropped from the first week, because I think that top players figured out how to build Dimir decks much quicker than the rest of the population. And unfortunately, because they drafted so many of the Dimir decks, I think that they depleted the source, and right now Dimir decks are not so great. It's still 57.6, but it's actually within the bottom three archetypes for the top players, because top players have higher win rates. The only two color combinations that increased compared to week one are Selesnya again, very, very marginal increase from 59.3 to 59.4. But that's enough to keep it in third place, and something that maybe people are not aware of, that Selesnya is the third best color combination right now. And the second one is Golgari, which increased from 57.2 to 58.3. So, and I've been beaten by some counter decks that looked pretty decent. And I think that, again, top players figured out, if you want to emulate that, just check the trophy lists and see what people playing Golgari are doing. Other archetypes did drop, including, the drop from 63 to 60.7 for Boros, and from 64 to 62.5 for Gruul, the top archetypes. They still remain top archetypes, again, as with general population, but they have significantly decreased their win rate. And then you have Selesnya in third, and then you have like a big cluster of things that are between 57 and a half and 58.5. Like all the other archetypes are in that zone, except for Orzhov, which is only at 53.5 with a 2 percentage point drop. And this means that the difference between general population and the top players in Orzhov is only half a percentage point, which is impressive, because the general win rate difference between top players and the rest is something like 4.5 percentage points. So yeah, this is really close between top players and general population, which means that it's really hard to squeeze a lot from Orzhov decks. A question is, does an increase in being drafted for Azorius and Boros naturally mean a bit less win rate because it is less open? Now, we have to keep in mind that this is only 17 lands users, which I would assume is around between 2 and 5% of all the drafts. So increase in how 17 lands players are drafting does not necessarily mean that general population is at the same kind of page with them. I would think that it's probably very close, and that general population tracks what's going on in 17 lands data, but it's only speculation that I can offer you there. So exactly how open a color is, I would have to go with the ALSA analysis and check how the ALSA changed over this time, which unfortunately I did not. But maybe it's a good note for me to make, that I probably should also check the some other metric that is 17 lands independent, like maybe openness of the archetype. I could calculate it for the week 1 and week 2, and I will do it for Bloomborough. But that's a very good suggestion, Karaoke. We can move on from the metagame evolution and how it changed over the first 2 weeks. And we can move to the actual main topic, which is the differences between different player groups. Idea, and I already had it like maybe 2 formats ago, but I never properly explored it, is that not every archetype is performing in the same way in each group. So there are decks that are doing much better in the hands of lower win rate players. And lower win rate can be because, I don't know, someone is just beginning to draft, or maybe, well, someone is having a rough format like me. Independently of what is the reason, people with lower win rates do exist, and they do deserve good advice that is custom based for their ability level. And I can't really give an advice for an individual using the data, because that will never be captured. And of course, there will be individual differences between players, and some people will be like extremely good in tempo decks, and some players will be playing amazingly with the mid-range, and that will be their personal preference. But we can definitely custom tailor advice based on cohorts. So you have the 3 tiers of players on 17 lands: the bottom tier, medium tier, and top tier. Bottom tier has win rates of roughly 49-50% on average. Medium tier has win rates of roughly 55% on average. And the top tier has the win rate of roughly 60% on average. And belonging to those groups means that you will do differently on average with different archetypes. And if you look at it, Azorius, so these win rates, I normalized them, which means that I brought them to the average of 50% games win rates, using some maths, dividing things and multiplying them in order to bring them together. Because of course, it's very hard to compare the win rates of top players that have an average win rate of 60% with bottom players that have an average win rate just below 50%. So by recalculating them, this should be roughly the same average for all the archetypes. And you can see that if we convert those win rates for each color pair to comparable values, I can actually now tell you that bottom players playing Azorius have roughly 52% win rate, while top players playing Azorius have roughly 49% win rate, which means that bottom tier players are overperforming with Azorius decks, while the top tier players are actually performing roughly on par of what you would expect from the average win rates that we calculated. And actually, medium tier players are underperforming with Azorius decks. So we have 3 groups of players, same kind of archetype, but they have a very different results with them. And it's the same with Boros, that bottom tier players have 53.7 average win rate, which is quite high actually when you think about it. Like because 50% of the games sort of it's recalculated what would happen if the 50% of the games would be won, 50% would be lost. um, 53.7 is quite a large deviation from that 50% average, especially for an archetype that is being played a lot. And top players are still doing decently with those archetypes, but not as well as the bottom tier players would do comparably. Which means that if you are in the bottom tier, if you are this 50% win rate gamer, sticking to or preferentially drafting Boros and Azorius and maybe Gruul is something that you might want to consider. Well, not that. So German Gario, true, it is. And I again did this analysis for all the formats since mid, and it actually turned out that in all of them, every single format since Midnight Hunt, the bottom tier was doing better if you normalize the data in Boros than the top tier group. It is this thing that Ham TV is sometimes mentioning, that when he picks a card, he says, "Look, this card, I can't squeeze too much from it, more than it says on the card. While the other card, I can make it sing." And this is the kind of a thing that top players will be able to do. They are capable of squeezing out the synergy out of cards. And they are some cards with maybe lower floor, but higher ceiling that top players will be much better with. The lower win rate tiers will generally do better with cards, color combinations that have this high floor and lower ceiling, because they will benefit more from having solid quality cards in their deck. Top players are better in making decisions that allow to squeeze more from the synergies and from cards that require a certain amount of planning, choice, selection, and stuff like that. But in the same analysis I did for all the formats since mid, Demir was better in the hands of top players in every single format, from mid to OTJ. But here we have the first time when actually Demir is doing better in the hands of bottom tier players. Obviously, relatively better, relatively to their average win rate. So that's a bit of a weird one. One color combination that in this set is doing way better in the hands of top players is it, where you have the 49% win rate for the top players and 46 for the bottom and medium tiers. So this is the color combination in the set that will require those synergy build arounds and squeezing out more from the card than the maybe beginner player will be able to. And Golgari is also a color combination where there is a significant difference between top and the bottom tier players. On the other hand, Orzhov is absolutely atrocious for top players, because this is the color that has, not only doesn't it have the high ceiling, but also the floor is not so high. Still, bottom tier players, they do manage to get their 50% out of it, which is a good result. So it means that those Orzhov decks can be quite decent in the brackets where the bottom tier players more frequently. What else do we see here? Gruul generally does well, and it does promote the better players. And I think that part of that preferential treatment is that they pick the right lane and they manage to build the deck slightly better. Selesnya is weird because it does well, but particularly good for the medium tier player. So if you are a medium tier player, if you think that I'm this 55% win rate person, then Selesnya is something that will benefit you, because it does have some synergy, not overly complicated, so you can squeeze more value out of it than a bottom tier player will be able to at their level. But it doesn't offer that super high ceiling that the synergy decks might be offering. So it's still like a hybrid mid-range kind of version of between pure rate and pure synergy. It lands somewhere in the middle, and potentially Simic decks are sort of like that. That the synergies are there, but they are pretty ham-fisted, which means that if you know how to build a deck around it, you'll be able to easily figure that one out. All right. So just because I was talking about those tiers, Just to give you the lay of the land, how does it look in like in MH3? Bottom tier 47% win rate, middle tier 54.8, and top tier 58.7 of across all the games. It is a bit lower than in previous sets, which I don't know, maybe more people are using 17 lands, and finally we're getting closer to the perfect scenario where everyone is using it, and I don't have to guess what the non-17 lands users are doing. Probably not. Probably this is just like a format that is prone to variance more than the others. That is maybe some combinations are really hard to beat. I noticed that sometimes your opponent opens with the turn 2, turn 3 play, and there's not much you can do about it, and you're just going to lose. And this is something that is not going to be promoting better players, and 17 lands users are generally better players. By the way, Nate Wesker, nice that you managed to catch it. And yes, Selesnya does have millions of super hidden synergies, which are super cool to explore. And is the third most winning archetype right now. So yeah, I was just telling that this is my secret archetype pick of the week, Selesnya. So yeah, I want to look at which cards are picked more aggressively by the top players or between tiers in general, and try to maybe speculate why that happens, and how does the regulation of what decks look like at the level of drafting look like. So normally I looked at the pick preference, which is what percent of the time do players pick the card when they see it. But I thought actually that's not the full picture. The full picture is that what ends in your deck is the product of what you pick, so your pick preference, but then you still need to decide that I'm going to play that card. And I decided to incorporate it in the analysis. So basically when I look at it is when you see a card, what are the odds that I will play this card in my deck? And are there cards that have big differences between player groups in terms of how frequently does the card end up in a deck when it's being seen during the draft? So yeah, first we're looking at the difference between top players and the bottom tier players. So between those 59% win rate players and those 47% win rate players, that's quite a large gap in the win rate between those two groups. And the biggest difference, and that's all in percentage points. Like every graph we look at here will be in percentage points. I just write percent because otherwise it will be crowded on a graph, but it is percentage points. So for example, if the top players would play the Amped Raptor in their deck 39% of the time they've seen it during the draft, then it means that the bottom players would do it 20% of the time. Yep, and the difference is 19 percentage points. And indeed, that's more or less what the numbers are here. The difference is 19 percentage points, and if I remember correctly, top players play it in their decks 42% of the time that they've seen it, and then bottom, of course, the 19 percentage points lower, so 23 or something. This card, the bottom tier players know that it's good, but they just don't pick it as if it was good. Once they pick it, they always play it. But the problem is that they pick it much less than the top players do. Top players, when they see the Amped Raptor, they go for it and they pick it. So yeah, it's a classic, and this is going to be the truth for all the top 4 cards. These are the cards that people know that they're good. They just don't fully commit into drafting them as if they were good as they know that they are. They do play them like they are good cards. They all played around 90%, more than 90% of the time that they pick it, they put it in their deck. But unfortunately for them, to some extent, they don't pick it often enough. It's the other cards we have on that list. Galvanic Discharge, 16 percentage point difference between top and bottom players. Lelia, the Blade Reforged, 15 percentage points. Guide of Souls, the card that we discussed earlier, the 1/2 that gains a life and then makes energy whenever a creature enters the battlefield. That's 12.4 percentage points difference. And, you know, it's still picked highly by the bottom player. It's just the top player pick it way, way higher. It's almost like a never pass kind of card, especially in pack 1. Area auxiliary. So, and then we move to cards that are both differential in terms of how they are picked, but also how they are put in the decks after they've been picked. So bottom players will leave those cards on the sidelines more frequently. And we have Area Auxiliary, the 4-mana 3/3 flyer that puts 2+1/+1 counters on 2 other creatures when it ETBs. We have the Detective's Phoenix, the 2/2 flying haste that can be bestowed for 1 red and collecting evidence, and you can bestow it from the graveyard. So that card also, top players are higher on it. You can see that sort of trend that it's mainly white and red cards. Ral and the Implicit Maze, another card in the red. We're going to get to what they're picking instead. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what exactly people pick instead of Guide of Souls because I don't know. But we're going to try to look at which cards do the bottom players value higher than the top players. Ral the Implicit Maze, that's the saga that sort of deals 2 damage to each of opponent's creature and planeswalkers, which might be relevant actually. And then culminates in making a Spellgorger Weird token, which I, by the way, have in paper now, so I'm ready for my draft next week. Sundering Eruption, that's the red MDFC. Falter, that can be a mountain, and has a couple of mini combos linked to it. Genko Future Shaper, that's the Azorius legend. It's a 2/5, and whenever a non-token permanent you control leaves the battlefield, you can make a creature. It's either a fox or a 2/2 fox with vigilance, or a 1/2 flyer, or a 1/1 lifelinker. And then you can also put counters on each creature you control. It's a very powerful card, and it can take over the game in a blink. But the problem with it is that it's in Azorius colors. And I think that the top players will see that card as, this is the reason I might be in Azorius, or I might splash blue or white. But yeah, I mean, it's still worth to treat it as a reason. And I think that the bottom players don't see it as a reason, and because of that, draft it a bit lower and maybe try to get it later. But actually, it's a good card to move into Azorius or to consider a splash. And the last card we have is Solar Transformer. That's the 2-mana mana rock. It is actually really good in this format. Has a high win rate, does quite a lot, and probably should not be limited to be played in energy decks. It's good in other combinations as well. But as you can see, most of the cards here are in the Boros space, and this also shows in the deck drafting data where top players will be drafting the Boros decks, for example, a bit higher, and are generally, I think, higher on red as a color. When we look at the top versus middle, we will see a lot of the same cards. And the fact that we see a lot of the same cards between different tiers is a very telling kind of piece of data, because that means that Amped Raptor, Galvanic Discharge, the differences here are smaller. It's like 9%, 8%, 7%, 5 percentage points. But most of them are the same cards, telling you that these cards, appreciation of them sort of increases proportionately as you progress with your win rate. So the better you become in the game, the more you value those particular types of cards, and the more you will preferentially draft particular color combinations. So again, we see Amped Raptor, we see Galvanic Discharge on this list, Lelia, Detective's Phoenix, Ral and Implicit Maze, Guide of Souls. All of these cards were on the previous graph. But we do have some newcomers, and these newcomers will show you that these are the cards that maybe are not a big difference between top and the bottom, but these are the cards that are quite deterministically different between the top and the middle players. So if you think you're in this mid tier of the players that are roughly 55, these are the cards you should be starting to look at and starting to think that, oh, maybe I should be playing those cards more frequently. And the first one is Path of Annihilation. That's the 4-mana enchantment. Whenever it ETBs, you get 2 Eldrazi's, and then Eldrazi you control have tap for any 1 mana of any color. And whenever you cast a creature spell with mana 7 or greater, you gain 4 life. So it's a great way of churning those big creatures earlier, and also getting some kind of life gain. By Mad Moses, by the way. And top players are super high on this. It opens a lot of synergies. It's a very important card if you want to play the ramp version of the Eldrazi deck that really wants to focus on the seven mana creatures, and it's great. And they pick it accordingly. They pick it quite higher than the rest of the groups. But specifically, it's not the kind of a card that will scale with the increase of your win rate level. The difference between the mid players and the bottom players for the Path of Annihilation is quite small. So it means this is the kind of a card that only when you get to this really high win rate level, you will start probably appreciating correctly, at least on average, as a group of people. Then we have Solar Transformer, which we already talked. So this is another card that scales up through the grades. And we have two other cards that top players evaluate much higher, and that's Scurry of Gremlins and Royal Cartographer. Scurry of Gremlins, the Boros signpost, makes 2 gremlins and a bunch of energy and can give your creatures basically what Imodane's Recruiter ability, sort of for 4 energy. And Royal Cartographer, the 2 mana 1/3 that gets energy for every land that enters the battlefield under your control. And then for 6 energy, you can draw 3 cards. And yeah, you missed the preamble, Uncle Cardboard. I was talking about how I suck in this format, and why people should be more honest about sucking in a format and owning it. But yeah, it seems like those 3 cards, Path of Annihilation, Scare of Gremlins, and Royal Cartographer, are these cards that are different between top and mid tier. So 2 synergy pieces for energy, 2 different styles of energy deck, one of them being more like creature aggro oriented, the other one being more control oriented, when those 3 cards are going to be super important at a certain stage, and 1 card that is built around kind of Eldrazi card that make the difference between top and the mid. And then we of course have to have the medium versus bottom. And I think that because when you think about it, on Arena, most people should be in the 50% win rate bracket. It's important to know how to level up. And in order to level up from this 50% win rate group, you should start thinking about what the group directly above you is doing differently. Because maybe you're not yet ready to go full all the way to what the top tier players are doing, but probably you should be looking at what the 55% win rate tier is doing, because that's what you should be aspiring to. My win rate is 50%. I want to move to 55%. And when I get to 55%, then I can start looking at 60% kind of cluster. And again, we start with the cards that are sort of universally changing between tiers. Again, the same for Amped Raptor, Lelia the Blade Reforged, Guide of Souls, Galvanic Discharge. Start thinking about why those cards are so well indicative of the player level in terms of win rate. Because I have honestly no idea. I think that they require a bit more planning ahead and sequencing, but that's more or less about it. And still, they seem to be so indicative of player win rate. But yeah, we have the Lelia, the Blade Reforge. You will have to think about how to attack with it beneficially so that it doesn't die and you get some value out of it. And maybe you can, maybe the lower win rate players will often miss the opportunity of playing that card. They will play their land instead of waiting with playing of the land for the attack and stuff like that. Small edges that will be gaining, and because of that, they don't value the card so highly. Guide of Souls, again, this card does not look as impressive as it is, but trust me, it is very powerful. It wins games. You play it on turn 1, and if the opponent doesn't have Galvanic Discharge in hand, probably you won that game. It's a very good chance, because like curving out Guide of Souls into the Slith and just swinging with a 3/4 flyer on turn 2, that's usually game set match. And also, this is why Galvanic Discharge is such an important card. It's the removal that will stop you from losing to Guide of Souls or turn 1, but also, if you have the right deck for it, it will kill the Writhing Chrysalis on turn 7 when it's 7-8, because you have energy left over from other things. So, yeah. Here we have a newcomer. We didn't have it on other graphs. It's a Springheart Nantuko. Mid players, they value that card way higher than the bottom players. And the card is weird, and this has a lot of text. And I'm not surprised remotely that maybe people that are just starting to play the game are not super stoked picking it. It is good. I mean, I played with it, and I copied like a bunch of Wumpuses, and it was fine. And I played against it, and my opponent played turn 2 Priest of Titania, turn 3 Springheart Nantuko. On the Priest of Titania, play a land, copy the Priest of Titania. And yeah, and I mean, they had so much mana by turn 5 that I couldn't do anything. And they just swarmed me with a bunch of like 7 mana things that they could play every turn. Signature Slam. That's another card that is picked much higher by the mid tier player than the bottom players. And again, I think that generally Clear Shot is the kind of a card that might confuse beginners. It doesn't look as powerful as it is, and this one is more powerful than Clear Shot. So yeah, just if you don't understand why this card is powerful, try playing with it more. And you will quickly realize how good this card can be. Now, of course, the problem becomes that very often those bottom tier players are actually right by not picking certain cards higher, because then they pick them and they don't win as much as they were promised that they will win. Because Signature Slam is very powerful if you play it in the right sequencing, and sometimes people will play too casually with cards like that and get burned because someone kills their creature in response, while the top players know exactly when to fire off a Signature Slam to minimize the chance that someone is going to stop them from killing the opposing creature. So there is often good reasoning behind what bottom players do from their perspective, and that's something that, as content creators, we probably should also take into account that people play things that they work for them, and the fact that I can make Signature Slam work for me a lot of the time doesn't mean that I should recommend it without those caveats that it's a good card, but you have to know how to apply it correctly. Then we have Air Auxiliary. We've seen that card before. Eldrazi Linebreaker. I think that this particular card is on this list mainly because less experienced player might underestimate how tricky it is to get this one colorless mana on the right turn. I've played with Eldrazi Linebreaker a couple of times, and it's not trivial to get the right combination of mana that will allow you to cast it on turn 3 when it will be potentially the most potent. Potentially the most powerful. Let's not do potentially more potent because it sounds awful. Another card that they will pick higher, Sundering Eruption. Same as before, this card is one of those linear cards where the evaluation of it becomes higher and higher as the skill progresses. And we're going to get in a second, half an hour probably, we're going to get into some reasons how people pick those cards differentially and how they are regulated. And I think this is the most interesting graph of the seminar. But first, let's talk about the cards that are picked less by the top players and mid-tier players. And the last one we have there is Titan's Vanguard. It's a very powerful card. It's worth speculating on. It does require a bit more dedicated deck. Like Chrysalis is, I think, easy to splash in lots of decks, but Titan's Vanguard, probably you want to have a dedicated deck for it. I mean, still, worst case scenario, it attacks as a 6/6 trample, which is not terrible. Okay. Now, cards valued lower by the top players than the bottom players group. And here we will have a very eclectic group of cards, but I think that there are some trends in there. One is Amphibian Downpour. That's the 3 mana flash enchantment aura. It has Storm, and it just basically turns things into 1/1 frogs. I don't think it's a bad card. I played it several times and I had some good results with it. The problem with it is that for me, this is not a reason to be in blue. It's far from it, actually. And I think that maybe the bottom players, they will see the rare symbol, they will see Storm, they will see the dream of turning a whole army of 7/7 Eldrazi into 1/1s. But in reality, the card will rarely do something as spectacular as that. Most of the time, it will be fine and should be drafted as a fine card. And I think top players identify it and they just draft it slightly lower than the bottom players who do draft it as a bomb, which it is not. And I think that's a problem with a bunch of those cards. Next, we have Shilengar, Sire of Famine. It's like 10 percentage points lower in terms of probability of ending in the deck than when it was seen in the draft than with top players. This card, again, it's a rate monster. And rate monsters are a classic example of those cards with high ceiling and low, high floor and low ceiling. So, well, this one has insane ceiling. It's just like unreachable, basically, because returning all creatures from your graveyard would be great. It just will probably never happen because either Schillinger will die or you will not have enough creatures to sacrifice. I'm sure there's kind of a white-black combo that you can do with the 5/7 Angel. Nate Wesker, yeah, the Amphibian Downpour is not great against the opponent attacking you with like 3 Faithful Watchdogs that you just make bigger by casting it. So yeah, and this is another thing. The card is dead against counters. So white, green, black is not great against it. Yeah, Essence Reliquary, on the other hand, is great with Downpour. That's true. But okay, Shilengar is like the classic example of a rate monster, and I think that those rate monsters will be preferred by lower win rate players. And there is a solid reason those cards should be better in their hands, because these are the high floor, low ceiling cards that they should be excelling with. So that difference might be actually something that is quite sensible from a perspective of a lower win rate player. However, if you want to move from lower win rate tier into the higher win rate tiers, you should start weaning a bit off from those high floor, low ceiling cards and start to incorporate more of those high ceiling cards. And having said all of this, that's definitely, there are some cards on the list here that are classic examples of these are the cards that are great, but they need a very, very specific deck. And I think that players that have a slightly lower win rate do not identify correctly when their deck is it. And Glaring Freshraker is an example of that card. It can be amazing in some decks, but I want it in the decks that do some outrageous things with it. Like you have the enchantment, the Eldrazi Typal enchantment that doubles all the colorless spell and doubles every colorless trigger. And then Glaring Fleshraker, just like you play 2 spells and it pings for 10 or something. This is the kind of a deck I would like to be playing it. I don't want to put it in my deck because it has like, I don't know, 5-6 colorless creatures in it. Because that's not going to cut the mustard for me. Like a 3-mana 2/2 is not good enough, even if it makes like 2 spawns across the game and then pings for 2. That's not enough. Same with It That Heralds the... And also like, it's a 3-drop that is really hard to cast because that colorless in the mana cost is not something trivial to pay. And I think that I'm sure that if you look at the mana bases of some of the bottom tier players, you will see that they play it in the decks where they shouldn't probably be making the deck because there's just not enough colorless mana sourcing in those decks. It That Heralds the End, same problem. Colorless in the cost for a card that you want to be dropping early is not super good. The bonus, giving a +1/+1 to a 7/7 is not that big a change, and that frequently will do it. Making the spawns 1/2s instead of 2/2s in this particular format also not that great. So it's a hard position card, and there will be decks for it, and top players will be much better at identifying it. But even more importantly, they will be much better in identifying where the card is not good in your deck. Again, Eldrazi Ravager, similar thing, colorless mana and the cost. This is something that makes the top players to stop and reevaluate, can I be playing it in my deck? And the bottom tier players seems to be much more willing to put those cards with colorless mana cost in their into their deck. Copy Crook, that's very dependent on what's in the battlefield, and again, there will be decks for it. I had it in my decks, but rarely. Definitely not a reason. Offers some dreams, but rarely delivers. I did get Crabomination from Copy Crook. Opponent played a Crabomination. I played my Copy Crook, copied their Crabomination, and from the copied Crabomination trigger, I hit another Crabomination. And that was definitely worth to put it in that particular game. But often it will be just sitting in your hand and you can copy, I don't know, an Eldrazi spawn, and you're not super happy about it. Devourer of Destiny, that's another card with colorless mana and the cost. That is not super trivial to play. Idol of False Gods, another card that does require colorless mana that is not super trivial to have. And this is something that you will notice from those top players. They will try to limit how much colorless mana they have and keep it only to the specific decks that can deal with playing colorless mana. And then we have two of the counter synergy cards. Fangs of Colonia. It can offer some of the most amazing starts in some decks, but very frequently this is going to be just a bad card in your deck if you don't have enough synergy. You need to really push for those counter synergies. I don't know, 7, 8 early creatures that will have counters on them naturally. That's something I want to have in my deck when I have Fangs of Colonia. Like, I don't know, 4 Watchdogs, happy to play it. Because if I play turn 2 Watchdog, turn 3, make it an 8/8, that's fine. Then I'm probably winning that game. But if I don't do that, it can be pretty poor. Maybe in some games when you can overload it and do insane stuff, it's going to be fine. And the same with Hydro Trainer. You really want to be all into those counter synergies in order to play the card. And I think that maybe less experienced players will be much more keen to put it in their deck when it probably should not be in there. When it comes to the differences between top and mid players, we again will see that there are some of those cards that are linear in terms of how popular they are. And It That Heralds the End, Glaring Fresh Raker, Amphibian Downpour, they were different between top and the bottom tiers, and they are also very different between top and the mid tiers, which means that on the whole scale of the win rates, it will be progressively less and less popular as players become better, on average, of course. Propagator Drawn is also on that list. That's the 2-mana 2/2 that can spawn Eldrazi spawns for 4 mana and gives all your tokens evolve. I mean, FC Motive. If Aken plays it, it must be good. I mean, that's the end. Aken lost. Well, that's a shame. But I can guarantee you that Aken will put the Downpour in their deck exactly when it should be there. Okay, but yeah, we have Propagator Drawn. By the way, if you play in paper, keep in mind that it gives evolve to not only your Eldrazi spawns, but every token that you have. So don't forget the triggers from evolve on every single token that you have. It's really good to, I don't know, pump up your Phyrexian germs that are under equipment somehow, and then you can move the equipment while not losing the germ. Springheart Nantuko. That's something that top players don't pick as highly as mid players, but if I remember correctly, mid players are particularly high on the Springheart Nantuko. Null Drifter, that's something that it looks so appealing. It's not as powerful as the feeling of the idea of playing Null Drifter is much more appealing than the actual results the card gets. And I think top players realize it, mid players still follow that dream. Territory Color, it's a good card. It's just maybe not as good as the medium tier players think that it is. They pick it super high and play it super frequently in their deck. Top players are a bit more moderate. So probably, if I would be guessing, like mid players will be trying to splash this card. They think it's powerful enough to be a splash card, but I don't think it is. And allegedly not. Neither do the top players. We have Copy Crook. That's another of those linear cards. Hydra Trainer, another of those linear cards that change with the tiers. And Devourer of Destiny, another of those linear cards that change with the tiers as they progress. And yeah, a lot of Eldrazi cards on that list. And that means that top players, they will streamline their Eldrazi decks in terms of what they put into them. And also they will abandon Eldrazi when they have to probably depend on things like I don't know, Propagator Drone or It That Heralds the End. They would rather move out and not pick Eldrazi at all. And the difference between middle and the bottom. Here again, bottom tier players are super high on Shield Gengar, and again, probably for their benefit, Amphibian Downpour, just proving that it's the most linear of the linear cards. Bottom players are higher on it than the mid players. Top players are higher on it than the mid players, and so on and so on. Perfect card that depicts the linear kind of development between tiers. Yeah, that's a good way to putting it, German Gary Oak. Mid players might see these cards as signals. Top players think that this is not a reason to be Eldrazi. It's more like a reward. And I think that we'll see that in a second in the graph. Idol of the False God, another card that we have seen before. Fangs of Colonia, we've seen before. Distinguished Conjurer, bottom players are way higher on that. This is a card that you want to be getting really late for a very, very specific deck, and it's not like super powerful card on its own. In some decks, it's going to be amazing, and I had that example of that yesterday. But in some card decks, it's not going to be just very mediocre, if not bad. And I think that mid players understand it. Bottom players might be seeing too much upside and the best case kind of scenario of thinking about it. Same with Worn Power Stone. The card can be great, but often it's going to be not doing enough if you don't draw it on the turn 3. So yeah. Eldrazi Ravager, we've seen. Flesh Raker, we've seen. Victimize, that's another card that I think maybe bottom players are more keen in playing in general. It's those sort of cards that offer a beautiful dream, but never deliver on that dream. Like Victimize offers you a dream. You know what? I like, I don't know, on turn 2, I'm going to cycle Eldrazi Ravager, or on turn 3, I'm going to cycle a 7/7, and then I'm going to sack my spawn to return those to the battlefield. But it's just like doesn't work like that ever. Most of the time, it's going to be a card that does quite little, and there will be decks that are pretty decent with it, and it's just like there's not many of them. That's why better players pick it a bit less. And Arcbound Condor, similar situation. Looking at the cards from the graphs before, I sort of divided them in 4 categories. So 1, linear, where evaluation changes constantly across the tiers in the same direction, either up or down. And we've seen a lot of examples of those cards. This is the most prominent category of cards, actually. Then there is the upper difference, I called it. It's the top players evaluate cards differently than the bottom and mid. Lower difference, where bottom evaluates the card differently than the top and mid. And development traps, where mid evaluates it differently from the bottom and top. It should be. Because then I will never remember to correct it. Mid evaluates is different from bottom and top, and this is like, I don't know if you know the meme format. There is this IQ bell curve, and there is the below average IQ person saying something, and the above average IQ person saying exactly the same thing but maybe more eloquently, and then there is the middle IQ person giving a monologue that disagrees with both of the other groups. And I think that these are the sort of like cards we're talking about here, that when you're in this middle development, you try to be too smart for your own good, and you start evaluating certain cards a bit higher, while actually you probably evaluated them correctly when you were a lower win rate player, because you didn't put as much thought into them as you should. And then you move to a certain level, and you again rediscover your long lost ability of ignoring a certain card. It's also sometimes you see that with soccer players, where when you start playing, you can just basically do the basic kicks and basic passes. Then you become like this middle advanced soccer player, and you start dribbling and tricks and whatever. And then you become a professional, and you go back to those simple passes because they are just more efficient and easier to make, and lower win rate. But Springhard Nantuko is different, really. Yeah, yeah. This is this the Tobias Funke quote. Some people try to fool themselves that it's going to work, but it never does. But it might for us. No. Um, so the examples of linear cards, and I tried to pick the two that are positive and two that are negative linear cards examples, where the evaluation increases and decreases. And we have the Amp Raptor Galvanic Discharge as the ones that increase with the win rate, and Amphibian Downpour and Glaring Fresh Raker that decreases. Then we have the upper difference cards example. These are the cards that the top players evaluate way higher or way lower than the other two groups. And here I have Path of Annihilation and Royal Cartographer as those positive kind of valued higher by the top players and no other group. And Propagator Drone and Emperor of Bones are the two that are valued lower by the top group than the other two groups. And I think that with Emperor of Bones, it's more like color than the card itself. It's a decent card. It's just the color is not enough to sway you to pick it highly. If black was a stronger color in this format, I'm pretty sure that Emperor of Bones would increase in evaluation of the top players. But because their evaluation of the card will be linked to the evaluation of the color the card is in, it is evaluated lower, because this is just on that border where it's quite strong, but not strong enough to pull the deck all by itself. So you probably want to pick it a bit later, when you had some like already solid black cards, rather than to pick it and then hoping that the good cards are going to come to you, because this is a recipe for disaster in this format. If you pick like a good card and you stuck to a color and no good cards arrive, you're just going to end up in a miserable draft. Trust me, I know from experience. Lower difference cards examples. That's the cards evaluated differently by the lower win rate. Two cards that lower tier players undervalue is Signature Slam and Eldrazi Repurposer. They are not super high on those cards. What they are high on is Victimize and Arcbound Condor. These are the cards that they like more than the other two groups. And again, because probably those cards offer dreams but don't deliver. While these cards are just really solid on rate cards that maybe don't look super appealing, but they are amazing when you see them in action, if you can play them correctly. And development trap cards, as who was that in the chat? Oh, FC Motive mentioned Springhard Nantuko is this classic development trap card. It's a good card. It's not like going to win you every single game that you play. And I think that the mid-tier players sort of treat it like this is the super hard bomb that will win every game. It's really good and it will win the games. It's just it's not albeit. And Null Drifter is the same kind of card that offers this advanced dream of card advantage and the 4/4 flyer that is, of course, unbeatable, except for the fact that best card in the format is a reach creature that has one more toughness than power and very easily becomes a 4/5, which probably is a big hit against the Null Drifter. Funderfunk, I mean, yeah, I told just seconds ago that my opponent put it on Priest of Titania on turn 3 and also won that game because they had like 24 mana on turn 6. Okay, And two cards that well, actually, because there were only 4 development trap cards in the format, I think that they were all in the same direction, where the mid-tier players were overvaluing them. Yeah, it's the other two are Titans Vanguard and Eldrazi Linebreaker. Guilty as charged, I probably overvalue both of those cards. And I think that this has something to do with the metagame rather than anything else. That Gruul Eldrazi kind of color pair has been overdrafted for some time, and because of that, these cards suffered from overdrafting of the color pair that they are in. All right, so where does the regulation happen? And I made this graph, and here on one axis we have the play rate difference between top and bottom. So these cards are played more by the top players, these cards are played less by the top players. And here we have the pick rate. So played, and by played I mean played once they were picked. So when they are picked, they are played more by the top players here and less here. And pick rate difference is that when they are seen, these cards are picked less by the top players, these cards are picked more by the top players. And graph looks like a bunch of dots, but when you look at this, here there are cards that are regulated at both points. These are those linear cards. The more they are picked, the more they are played also. So at both levels of the regulation, top players are preferentially using those cards. Not only they pick them more highly and more frequently when they see them, but also once they pick them, they end up in the deck more frequently. And it's the reverse for those cards. So basically, these ones are not only they're picked less when they are seen, but also even when they are picked, they end up in the deck less frequently. But we have also a couple of interesting categories that are different. Here are some cards that are regulated at pick rate only. And when you look at those cards, we have all those 5 cards that were dominating the first graphs. Amped Raptor, Galvanic Discharge, Lelia, the Brothers Reforged, Guide of Souls, Detectives Phoenix. And I don't understand exactly what's going on in there. But that means that these are the cards that the bottom tier players know are good, because they 95% of the time when they pick them, put them in their deck, but they don't pick them as frequently as they should. And this is the Amped Raptor difference. And, this 20 percentage points difference. It means that the top players will pick it roughly twice as often when they see it than the bottom tier players. They might not just pivot for these cards as much. That's true. They might not be willing to, I don't know, splash them. Yeah, very likely. Okay. But yeah, these 5 cards are a specific group on their own, and I thought that it would be interesting to highlight them, maybe to show you that these are actually worth pivoting. Then you have the speculative cards. Why do I call them speculative cards? Because top players pick those cards more frequently, but when they pick them, they put them in their deck less frequently than the bottom tier players, which means that they are keen on picking those cards, but then are very selective on where they put them in the deck. And this is for me like what I do when I draft, when I speculate on the card. I pick it because I usually can get it somewhat late, and I know the card is powerful, but I'm not stuck on the idea of putting it in my deck. It's just like, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, I'm happy to leave it in the sideboard. So I just basically speculated with my pick that maybe I will be in the right lane to play it. But I do know that it comes with the risk that I'm not going to be playing it, because I will not be on that lane. That's why I call it speculative cards. And couple of examples of those cards. Ophiomancer, very powerful card, but in black, which means that maybe you will not be in the right lane, because black is quite drafted right now for its power, because the power is not there. So if I see Ophiomancer, I'll pick it. but frequently I'll abandon it and draft something else because I didn't manage to get on the FC Motive. Very good question. As you can see, there is a landscape here, and that landscape represents a bunch of landscapes that are all in that area. There is like 4 or 5 of the landscapes in the speculative cards. Top players like to pick speculative landscapes to be open to playing other colors. But yeah, Ophiomancer is more like a black card that you speculate on the fact that maybe black is open, and if it's not, then you just happily not play Ophiomancer, even though it's a good card, but it's not like a busted bomb. Nightshade Dryad, same. It's a really good green card for a specific green deck. You want to pick it highly, but if you don't see cards that support that sort of deck, you don't want to play the Dryad in every green deck that you play. It will frequently be left in the sidelines. So speculative card example. Landscapes, all of them, or at least most of them are in that speculative card group. Because yeah, again, you pick them, maybe you're going to play them, maybe not. The tendency of the top players is to play fewer of those landscape lands than at least I played in the first week. And again, Cord was, as always, bang on with his analysis without even looking at a single piece of data. How does he do it? I don't know. I'm jealous. That you should maybe trim down on playing landscapes if you don't do well in the format, because I think that there is a cost of playing too many of those, and part of that cost is not drawing enough land later in the game because you filtered 4 already. And there's Depth Defiler as an example of one of those speculative cards, like a really strong card, really powerful card, but a lot of things need to go right in order for you to fit it in your deck. Like you need colorless mana, you need 2 blue, so you need to be quite heavy on the blue, and because of that, you might want to speculate on it, but you definitely are going to have a lot of drafts where you're just going to have to abandon playing it. And then smallest category, but these are the cards that are picked. I call them cards picked only with a clear lane, because they are picked less frequently by the top players than by the bottom players. So they actively don't pick those cards as frequently when they see them. But when they pick them, they end up in their decks much more frequently. So these are the cards. These are the example of the cards. Scurrilous Sentry, the 3 and a black human Night Rogue with Connive when it ETBs and whenever it attacks, and Menace. And this is a great card in the blue-black. And it usually goes quite late, but you just don't want to put in every single deck. Probably want to only pick it when you sort of feel like you're going to have to play it. And then you're probably going to have access to any number of those. Bespoke Battle Wagon. It's a really good card for a specific build of the energy deck. But again, you don't want to be dedicating high picks to that when you are not already in that lane. And top players do understand it, and they will pick it only when they want to put it in their deck. That's why you have this kind of difference. And the same with Voltstrom Angel. It's a good card. It does need a specific deck. Probably the sort of kind of more mid-rangey version of White Red, or some kind of a Blue-White Skies kind of deck that based on energy. But you don't want to jam it into every one white deck that you're having. And you should look at the win rate of that card. It's less impressive than you probably thought. And a bunch of the cards on that list, Waterlock Teachings is representative of it, but a bunch of those, as you had the landscapes and the speculative cards, the MDFCs are definitely in the cards picked only with a clear lane kind of category for the top players. So top players do pick their MDFCs when they know that they're going to be playing them, and they don't waste picks on them speculatively. So that's maybe an interesting finding. Okay, so now we can move to the win rate differences, because of course, before that we were talking about the preferences in draft and what is the sort of different behavior in the draft of the players. Now we can look at what can they make differently with the cards that they pick. So which cards win in the hands of higher tier players more than win rate difference between the tiers would suggest. And normally I just looked at the absolute difference in win rate, but this time I normalized all the data again to the 50%, so I can compare them directly and see the differences. So actually, when you look at the first win rate difference, that's between top and bottom tiers, Izzet Generatorium has a difference of almost 10 percentage points between the normalized win rate of the top players and the bottom players. This is huge because this means they are all at 50% on average win rate. And this one still has like 10%. This is the ultimate card for this set that tells me you need to understand how to build Izzet Generatorium decks. You need to have a deeper understanding of the game in order to make it work. And this is potentially something that we've seen 100 slides ago. God, I hate how many slides I made. When we look at the difference between tiers, you saw that the top tiers players do understand Izzet so much better than the other groups, and Generatorium is probably one of the reasons why it happens. This you can admire my consistent slide making when I'm scrolling through them. Oh, there we go. We went too far. There we go. Yeah, so if you are in the bottom tier, definitely lean on content creators. I think Alex, again, I'm going to recommend Alex because why wouldn't I? Made a great piece of content about what are his thoughts on putting Izzet Generatorium into his decks, and it does require quite a lot for that card to be decent. Another card we have there that has a big difference is Tamiyo meets the Story Circle. This is the classic Sam Black card. And if it's a classic Sam Black card, it means that it does require a lot of decision making, a lot of thinking. And probably that explains why there is a big difference between the top and the bottom tier players' win rates for that card. Waterlogged Teachings, another card. This partially reflects the tutor nature of the card. Tutors are always tricky because they offer much more choice than the normal kind of card when you cast it. And picking the right moment and the right card to select from Waterlogged Teachings will be paramount. Also, building your decks, especially when you have like a couple of copies of Waterlogged Teachings, building your decks so that it becomes a toolbox deck is something that will always promote more experienced players. Card that I was found quite surprising to be on that list was Fanatic of Ronas. Card looks pretty straightforward. It's 2 mana, 1/4 mana dork, but it has Ferocious, so whenever you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it can give 4 mana. Top players do way better with it, and I think that's partially because they build the deck in order to enable Ferocious and then also benefit from having the 4 mana from Fanatic of Ronas. I guess that this shows you that top players, once they get ahead, and this card can very easily get out of hand and put you so far ahead. Once they're getting ahead, they are much better front runners, and that's the kind of a card like Fanatic of Ronas will provide them with. Reform, another card that they do much better with. Again, this is the card that on its own is really hard to play because people can play around it in a million ways. But if you build right, it can very quickly move to the 9/9 creature level and then becomes good. So I think top players are more capable of building around Reform, and maybe they put it in a deck when the deck naturally is sort of like built around it, and they will not play it when the card is looking sus in their deck. You don't want to play it as a vanilla 0/1 for 4 mana, that's for sure. Cyclops Superconductor, that's probably the effect of the difference in the Izzet decks. Same with Reiterating Bolt. You will see a lot of those energy, blue, red cards on this list. Unstable Amulet, this is another card that promotes top players. This one offers, again, quite a lot of choice. It requires good sequencing. If you don't sequence it well, it will not be as good as possible. It does require deck building, very much like Izzet Generatorium, where it becomes exponentially better when you can activate it, 5 times instead of twice during the game. I had decks where it became like a basically a kill plan, and I had a couple of amulets, and I was casting spells from them and pinging opponent for 2 every time I did it. So yeah, sweet card, but does require both decision making and deck building decisions that are correct. Cursed Wombat. I don't know why Cursed Wombat does better, but maybe it's protected better by the top players. Maybe they will always make sure to get one trigger out of it and not just run it out on turn 2 into the Galvanic Discharge. But yeah, I can only speculate about the reasons. And the last one on the list is Emissary of Soulfire. Again, not this card can be done into so much more. I've seen a screenshot on Twitter, and I don't remember who it was, but it could have been Nerdy Steve maybe, with 44 exalted triggers on stack due to some careful use of proliferate and proliferating the exalted counters so many times that every attack with a 1/1 was dealing 45 damage, which must have been a sweet game. Differences between top and middle. Again, we see the Tamiyo meets the story circle, which makes it the most defining card between the top tier and the rest of the players. Bespoke Battle Wagon. Again, we see those energy synergies, and it's absolutely understandable when we know that energy decks are something that does benefit the top players more than the rest. They're harder to build, harder to make functional. Then we have the Hydra Trainer. This is a card that probably has a higher win rate between those two groups because of the selection when to put it into their decks. We've seen that card being differentially picked, and top players like it less, which means that when they pick it, they probably are much more selective and they have the right deck to put it in their deck, and therefore it performs better, because in a very dedicated counters deck, that card works. I can tell you that I put the Lion Umbra on top of Hydra Trainer in a deck that had a lot of counters, and I could... Aura gives it vigilance, so I could exert it every single attack and make it every single attack into like a 12/12. And I slowly turned it into an abyss where opponent had to sacrifice a creature every single day just not to die from Hydra Trainer. And obviously, in the end, I won that game because they couldn't keep up with the losing a creature every turn while I was expanding my board myself. Then you have Genku Future Shaper. Again, card is good, but requires careful planning. You need to know how to get rid of permanent, non-token permanent from the battlefield to trigger it. You need to know when to put the counter on it, creature control, and stuff like that. We have Izzet Generatorium again, which makes it second card after Tamiyo meets the story circle, where it's consistently better in the hands of the top player. Consuming Corruption. This is like, again, a bit more build around the card, a card that requires careful deck construction. I think all the cards on this list are sort of cards like that, that require decisions, deck building at the same time. And these cards will just promote top players. And again, if you think that you're approaching that top player kind of level in terms of win rate or ability, this is the moment when you should start thinking about those cards. They are on this list. I'm not going to give you recipes on what to do with them. I'm just going to give you the numbers that show you that better players, higher win rate players, do disproportionately better with those cards. And there is a reason for that. And you need to figure out those reasons. And especially you personally need to figure out why you're not winning with those cards. And it's only through that you can level up. I can't tell you what to do to level up. You need to figure it out, because the whole point of leveling up is that you're able to figure things out. But it's good to have pointers on which cards to look specifically. Consuming Corruption, that requires decks that have a lot of swamps. And I'm pretty sure that people put it in decks that don't have enough swamps, and because of that, it doesn't work so well. Top players will limit when they put this card in their deck to the exact decks that can support that card. We have the teachings again, so that's the third card on the list that is consistently better in the hands of the top players. Giving so much choice is coming with certain bonus for people that know what they are doing, it turns out. Sneaky Snacker on the list. Again, this card does require some deck building, and it does require some in-game decisions, and it does require careful sequencing, which again will benefit. The more decisions need to be made, the more benefit the top players are. Roland Implicit Maze, that card has plenty of synergy in it, and knowing when to cast it, how to benefit most from it. Also, I'm pretty sure that top players are more likely than all the other ones to pair it up favorably with the Essence Reliquary. All those little things add up into the higher win rate proportionally when you compare between those groups. And the last, Emissary of Soulfire, that's the fourth card that appeared on both lists. So like a bunch of the cards appeared on both lists, and all of them require lots of choices, but also present you with interesting deck building decisions where top players seem to do better in those. And we have the last comparison between middle and bottom bracket. And when I said Izzet Generatorium is markedly better in the hands of the top players compared to all the other two groups, it still is also markedly better between middle and bottom tier players. And this is really a good indicator card. If you can make decks that with Izzet Generatorium that win, that means that you're getting to the level where you can start thinking about calling yourself a good player. Because understanding how to build them is indicative of certain skill set that also is linked with higher win rate. So think about how to build those Izzet Generatorium decks, and maybe in the process of thinking about this specific deck, you will click some other things linked to deck building process. So I think that this is a good learning card in a way that it requires a lot from you as a player to make this card work efficiently. And if you ever have an opportunity of trying to draft the deck using it, I would say take it, even if it was endangering your gems when you think you might be in this bottom tier of the players. Reform, we've seen it before, and that means it is a linearly kind of developed card. Was it in the top versus bottom? Yeah, it was. So here, because it's both on the top versus bottom and middle versus bottom, this means that those 50% win rate players are doing particularly worse with the reform than the other two groups. So this is the card indicative of being in this 50% group, while there is no win rate difference between the top and the middle players when they're playing with reform. Proportionally, of course, because still top players will probably have like 4 to 5 percentage points higher win rate with reform, just because that's the difference between the groups. But if you proportionally change those win rates to 50% average, no difference between middle and top players. But disproportionately more winning by both top and middle players versus the bottom players. Reiterating Bolt, we've seen that again before, which means that the bottom players are not great in playing with this card. Potentially, they are not putting it in decks that have enough energy generation. 2 mana for sorcery speed, deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker is just not good enough for the power level of this set. But if you can replicate it reliably, then then the card can be pretty good. Hunger Tide Rises, it is a combo card in a sort of way, I guess. Like you want to really play it when you have Grist in your deck to get it on board through that. Turns out that the mid-tier players are actually right by playing their beloved Spring Card Nantuko, because they actually do way better with it than the bottom tier players. So they disproportionately win more with Spring Card Nantuko, proving that maybe they were right in the first place to play it in their decks. Cursed Wombat, again, this shows that the players with this 50% win rate are doing just worse with that card than the other groups. And this is an interesting thing to think about. Why does it happen? What is the thing that limits them from the bottom tier players from winning more with the Cursed Wombat, while mid and top tier players do proportionately better with it? So what makes it tricky? Proud Pack Rhino. I don't know why it's on the list. Honestly, I can't even be stretched to hypothesize. We see Fanatic of Ronas again. So again, same thing. Bottom tier players don't know how to fully exploit the power of that card, even though the card is clearly powerful in the hands of the top and the middle tier players. And last we have Sage of the Unnoble. This is probably the reason for that is probably putting this card in the deck should be a sporadic thing and not a frequent thing. And I'm pretty sure that bottom tier players put it way too frequently into their deck to the detriment of their win rate. And it heralds the end. Again, potentially this is a selection result where middle tier players don't put it as frequently in their deck and therefore have a disproportionately higher win rate with it because they don't put it in the deck where it shouldn't be. And then we have the cards that are opposite. They do better in the hands of the bottom tier players, proportionately again. We have Voltstrom Angel, high floor, relatively low ceiling. It will work better in the game level situations that the bottom tier players play more frequently in. And with 50% win rate, you're going to be more frequently than not in the platinum rather than in the diamond/mythic bracket. And I think that cards like Voltstrom Angel will just do better in those brackets because your opponents will frequently not be equipped in dealing with the kind of card like Voltstrom Angel. So it just becomes better through that. Ophiomancer, again, good players identify that Ophiomancer is something that needs to be dealt with very rapidly, otherwise you're going to lose that game. Maybe when bottom players play in the in the gold platinum kind of level, people left the Ophiomancer uncontested, and uncontested Ophiomancer will sooner or later take over the game, and that's just going to happen. We have Copy Crook, card that becomes just so much better when you're playing against high floor, low ceiling cards, because you will steal something that is naturally powerful. Because if you copy not your creature, which frequently will be the case, you probably don't want to be stealing a synergistic thing because it doesn't synergize with your deck, it synergizes with their deck. You have frequently good targets for Copy Crook in the lower gameplay tiers where bottom tier players will be playing more frequently. Linebreaker does this is the opposite of what we had with Spring Card and Tuco, that actually this is the card that the bottom players do better with. It's a powerful card. It doesn't require too much thinking when you cast it. It's just a 4/3 haste that gives all your other Eldrazi haste or your other creatures haste at some stage, and if not, it still will attack as a 4/3 trampler. Twisted Riddle Keeper. I don't know why top players cannot win with it, but probably from what I noticed is that if you manage to get to the late game, you need to be doing something a bit bigger than the Twisted Riddle Keeper to win the game consistently. If you only rely on like Twisted Riddle Keeper as your top end kill engine for an Eldrazi deck, you frequently just bounced off a Chrysalis or you'll be too far behind because they go wider and it will just not do enough. That was my issue with it. And I think that maybe if you're playing against less powerful decks, it can become disproportionately more powerful. And same situation with the Devourer of Destiny that I found a bit underwhelming as just a 6/6. That 6/6 are being eaten quite easily in those late game, and you won't be casting it before that late game. Okay, the Obstinate Gargoyle, it just does so bad in the hands of the top players that there is a difference through that. Card is pretty bad. Territory Color, again, this card does not perform amazingly in the hands of the top players, but it performs really, really well in the hands of the bottom tier players. High floor. This one actually has a medium ceiling. It's not a low ceiling. It's a pretty decent ceiling, but the floor is really, really high. Again, that's going to be benefiting bottom players. Master of the Departed. No explanation for that card at all. I don't know why the bottom tier is doing better than the top tier with it proportionally. And Witch Enchanter, similar situation. It's I don't know why. I don't have to have an explanation for everything, damn it. What do we have here? Again, Shilgengar, we've seen it as a card that was preferentially more picked by less experienced players. But we see also that the less experienced players do manage to win more with it. So again, I was telling you that perhaps there is a logic in what the lower tier players are doing. They're picking cards that they are doing better with. And here we see the difference in the win rate. Middle tier players are winning more with Shilgengar while picking it more. So they make a very sensible decision. It's sensible from their perspective. It might be counterproductive if they want to improve, but it's their decision in the end. Proud Pack Rhino, very high floor. Ceiling is sort of meh, but it's a free drop, so let's not expect miracles. Great little card and does well for the mid tier players. So if you're aspiring to the mid tier, look more on that card because it looks great. I'm pretty sure it can work pretty well in the bottom tier as well. Coco, that's the official name of this card. No, Coco. Everyone calls it like that. Kozilek's Command. I like that card. It's hard to cast though, and it does better for the mid tier kind of group of players. It's something I think to do that top players are not really good in getting into those like. Yeah, I know that Coco is Collected Company. That was the joke, damn it. I do play Constructed, despite. Ooh, do we have a raid? Yeah, Rosemary T. Thank you for the raid. Also, Gilda MTG Journey Top. Journey to Pro. Thanks for the raid half an hour ago, and thanks Snipes and Yuri for the subs. Very much appreciated. I can only look at what's going on Twitch once in a while. So sorry if I didn't call out earlier. So Kozilek Command, another kind of card that doesn't do well with the top players, and I think that this has something to do with difficulty of getting those proper Eldrazi colorless decks functional in Diamond and Mythic. Envoy of the Ancestors, relatively simple card, but again, I think that against super streamlined decks is just too slow for this format. But maybe like in the lower tiers of competition, it can be pretty good. It's been quite strong against me a couple of times, but a couple of times it's just like they cast it and you look at them and say, "What, are you going to tap out when I'm just doing lethal next turn?" I don't think so. So yeah, it can be problematic. Spring Cardon Tuco and Detectives Phoenix, both doing better in the hands of the mid-tier players, thus proving again that despite top players having higher win rate, mid-tier players, they pick the Spring Cardinal Tuco higher than any other group, and it works for them. And this is something that maybe like if there was a couple of messages I would like to confer is that look at those cards that are being picked speculation and look at the cards that are picked only when you have a clear lane, but also think that if from the perspective of a top player, some decisions might seem to be not optimal because they don't win with the card as much, it might be an optimal decision from your perspective as a mid-tier player to do things differently than top players, and maybe slowly move into the what top players are doing as you progress in your win rate level. Again, we see territory color. This is the kind of a card. I think that this is the general trend across all those groups, is that those high floor, not necessarily super high ceiling cards are performing better with the lower win rate players. And if you are someone that wins, again, between 50-55% of the time, you should be maybe thinking about, if you want to preserve your win rate, play more of the cards that are exactly like that. High floor and low ceiling. Horrid Shadow Spinner, I will not explain that because I don't know how I would do that. On Do Not Master also, I don't know how to do that. There is definitely, the top players are doing very, very badly with Orzhov, and that probably explains part of why this card is performing better for the mid-tier players, because the win rate for top players with Orzhov is just horrifically bad. And the Ophiomancer makes the list still, probably same reason. It's just harder to win with the Ophiomancer against other good players, which top players usually have to compete against, because you can only play that many drafts before you get into Mythic when you're having 60% win rate. And the interesting group between mid and bottom tier in terms of the 17 lens win rate, which cards are the determining ones where the bottom tier player do better. And we've seen some of them already before, like Genko we've seen, Devourer of Destiny we've seen, Volstrom Angel we've seen. All those cards are doing just better for those 50% win rate players proportionally, which means that they pick those cards higher, but they do work for them. We've seen the Master of the Departed also doing better with the bottom tier players before. Dreadmobile, by the way, I'd like to have some praise for the fact that I picked the German version for the picture. It was hard to find. Yeah, it's not that I automatically find the German, but I love the Schreckmobile. And we have two cards that we've seen those groups picking higher. Null Drifter. Okay, they pick it higher. It doesn't work for the top players, but it does seem to have slightly higher win rate. So why wouldn't you be playing? And Victimize, again, that we were saying, oh, bottom tier players are picking Victimize so much higher. Ha ha ha. They actually do also win with the Victimize higher. So again, the myth that the top players are doing everything that is better is not necessarily confirmed with the data, that bottom tier players do things that are better in their particular tiers frequently. Not always. And in the end, their tier has 50% win rate, which is a problem. But they do short-term rational decisions with maybe long-term skill is not at the level that would allow them to move higher and apply those more advanced strategies. What do we see still? Sneaky Snacker, Pinnacle Monk, and Legion leadership. As you know, a card like Legion leadership in top tier is just, people see it coming, and that makes it less efficient. When you're playing against players that maybe will not see it coming, it becomes so much better. Stumbling, but it's been a long stream and it's been a long day. We get there. So hope you enjoyed. Hope it was enlightening. Hope you found out something different from most of the content. That's what I'm aiming at. And hopefully you change how you see the difference in skill level and the difference in difference between the top tier players and bottom tier players, and how you should approach learning and progressing through those brackets, and how not to be ashamed on being on one tier, and how that lack of shame of being in one tier will make you learn better, because you know exactly which cards to look at and which cards to focus. And with that, I'd like to thank the 17th Land team, Viral Misnomer especially. He's going to be very busy very soon. So thoughts and prayers for him. Ale Baldini, definitely thoughts and prayers for him, because he's dragging every kind of development in 17 lands right now on his overworked back. And thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who is currently battling Oath of Druids and Lurus somehow. Who is my helper in getting this in the podcast format, and an amazing person with excellent hair and fantastic face. Thanks to him for all the help that he's doing. And of course, thanks to my patrons, especially the 3 new ones. Clicks to a different window. Eli, Reese, and Michael. And hopefully this space pending for you very soon, if you want to join. Thanks to MTGA Zone and SSQ and Mana Junkie for the music that I used for the podcast. And I'll see you next week. And if you're listening to LR, then continue doing that. But if you don't, then you might want to tune in this week, because there might be some familiar person on it this week, hopefully in a much better mental situation and not basically fainting from tiredness. With that, I'll see you next week.